prince and all the powers of hell!
That scene from the animated Sleeping Beauty was one I forgot as I pre-screened shows for our first child when she was little. Thinking classic animated Disney movies were a safe bet for my 5-year-old, I almost didn't watch it beforehand. When Maleficent calls down all the powers of hell, I remember being stunned, having no recollection of that moment. While the film makes the villain a villain and good triumphs in the end, I didn't need my 5-year-old to memorize that line and recite it within earshot of any of her grandparents or my church members, or simply being terrified of the green flames and dragon that emerges to confront the heroic prince. That may seem overprotective, but as a parent who has had to comfort his kids in the middle of the night due to thunderstorms or nightmares, I would rather preserve what precious sleep we get than to risk an all-nighter. I did let her watch it later. While some may protest that any images of villainy are inappropriate, I would push back and suggest that the presence of evil villains is part of storytelling that can show the power of good. David defeating Goliath, Daniel surviving the lion's den, and Christ defeating Satan. However, given the evangelical suspicions related to Disney, these storytelling dynamics might simply be dismissed in favor of sinister plots related to Disney's secret motives for telling stories. However, around 1963-1964, Walt Disney wrote an essay entitled Deeds Rather Than Words for a book called Faith is a Star. In his essay, he reflected on his Christian upbringing and how it shaped his storytelling. Disney writes, quote, "In these days of world tensions, when the faith of men is being tested as never before, I am personally thankful that my parents taught me at a very early age to have a strong personal belief and reliance in the power of prayer for divine inspiration. My people were members of the Congregational Church in our hometown of Marceline, Missouri. It was there where I was first taught the efficacy of religion, how it helps us immeasurably to meet the trial and stress of life and keeps us attuned to the divine inspiration. Later in Demolay, I learned to believe in the basic principle of the right of man to exercise his faith and thoughts as he chooses. Deeds, rather than words, express my concept of the part religion should play in everyday life. I have watched constantly that in our movie work, the highest moral and spiritual standards are upheld. Whether it deals with fable or with stories of living action, both my study of scripture and my career in entertaining children have taught me to cherish them. But I don't believe in playing down to children, either in life or in motion pictures. I didn't treat my own youngsters like fragile flowers, and I think no parent should. Children are people, and they should have to reach to learn about things, to understand things, just as adults have to reach if they want to grow in mental stature. Life is composed of lights and shadows, and we would be untruthful, insincere, and saccharine if we tried to pretend there were no shadows. Most things are good, and they are the strongest things, but there are evil things too, and you are not doing a child a favor by trying to shield him from reality. The important thing is to teach a child that good can always triumph over evil, and that is what our pictures attempt to do. I think this essay is good to keep in mind as Disney announced this year its plans for creating Villains Land at their theme parks. I can almost predict the wave of panic and pearl clutching from Christians, seeing it as an attempt to lure our innocence to the dark side. Perhaps that is the case, or perhaps it's just an attempt to make money, or maybe it recognizes that those villains and all the fear that they bring are part of good storytelling. Storytelling provides an opportunity to walk in scary places, to overcome them, and re-emerge into the light, reminding us that good always triumphs over evil, and evil can be defeated. In this final episode of our Dark Disney miniseries, we conclude our interview with Terry Lindvall exploring goodness in fairy tales that have dark moments. This episode is called Dark Disney, Light in the Shadows. I'm Dr. Seth Pierce, and welcome back to Beast and Bible. So here's kind of a big question, because I can hear people listening to this ask this question because I've asked it of me before. They've made statements. Some people of faith might claim that this kind of silliness diminishes the seriousness of sin or the occult, making it entertaining and appealing. How would you respond as a communication scholar and an educator to that concern? In other words, if my kid watches this, they're not going to take the occult and death seriously. They might even get interested in it.
Yeah, I think it may. I mean, that's the one thing, is that there is some legitimacy in that argument that if we become so flippant about it, if we become so irreverent, that we could reduce it to kind of basically a gag. That's a possibility.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there's something about life that we recognize our jokes and gags about death are still in this time zone. We are still in this life, which is a valley of shadows. We're in a life where death does come. And suddenly there is this shock. And the one thing I think Lewis and Tolkien both did, borrowing from George MacDonald, is that in their literature, they would kind of create moments that would awaken us to this reality of the darkness. They want to awaken us. Now, Disney did not seek just to awaken us. Disney basically just made it silly. And so you don't go to Disney's cartoons for devotions.
You're right.
But you do go to some of these other kind of fantasy writers who are able to take the darkness and wrestle with it more deeply. When you read Lewis's science fiction trilogy and you see that Ransom wrestles with Weston, this man who's become kind of a demonic presence, you feel the power of evil in that hideous strength. The same thing. You get a sense that something's going on. This is where Lewis borrowed from Charles Williams very much in his supernatural thrillers. I remember in seminary, I could not read Charles Williams at night. I would get scared. And I look back now, I can laugh at it, but at the time, it was just so harrowing. He was able to kind of create this kind of occult world where you realize there's something here that's real. The first Disney film I saw that scared the pucky out of me was Darby O'Gill and the Little People.
Oh, it's classic.
Okay, when the Banshee comes, and the Banshee kind of is a prophetic kind of foreseer of death coming, and it's just I hid behind a sofa. I remember I was about 9 years old and hiding behind a sofa in my grandmother's house. Just I couldn't watch it. It just haunted me for weeks after that, and so there I think Disney was able to use some old Irish legends and kind of awaken this kind of spiritual danger that is out there. And there is the danger. For someone who's seen kind of demonic activity when I was in seminary of all places, you go, there is a presence that's evil that you don't want to mess with. But at the same time, Disney plays with it. And there is a time for playing with it and kind of just saying, okay, it's not something that we as Christians have to worry about.
Yeah. You've highlighted the tension really well. I think it's that fine line to walk between, for Christians to take their worldview seriously. You know, there's good and evil, there's light and dark. You know, this is not a game. And at the same time, you know, there's that extreme of being really fearful and paranoid, you know, and terrified, which, you know, when reading the Bible, you know, the goal to live a life, you know, of Christ is not characterized by fear. You know, it's peace and love. And there are moments, I mean, looking at, it's not quite mocking death, but it's certainly mocking a very serious situation. You look at the prophet Elijah, and you've got the prophets of Baal that are engaged in this, you know, cultic practice. They're cutting themselves. There's bloodshed. They're screaming. It's a pretty horrible scene. And he's on the hill just laughing and making fun of it, you know. And so there are moments, well, and even, you know, the words, "Oh, death, where's your sting?" It's this, you know, sort of mocking, you know, tone to it. And so I think there's that. And that's maybe uncomfortable for people to realize, there's a time to say this is serious, this is not a laughing matter. And there's other times to say, you know what, we can make a joke out of things. And what is it? What is C.S. Lewis's quote? Was it "Joy is a serious business of heaven"? Do I have that right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there are moments to say, we're going to laugh at this, and we're not because we're flippant, but because we have security and we've got the assurance of victory. And
one thing we notice too by reading scripture is that we are called to fear the Lord. I mean, the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. And this word in Greek, kind of phobia, is really used in a different way. If we remember kind of in Matthew, when the women are leaving the tomb, basically they left the tomb with phobia and great joy. Now, that doesn't mean fear like we are afraid of something, but it basically means reverence. I mean, there's a reverence for the Lord. There's that kind of fear. When we look at the scripture, one thing we recognize is that when the good comes, when an angel comes, the first words generally are, "Fear not." Mm-hmm. Goodness is scarier than evil. because we are the sinful creatures. For example, when I asked my students, I said, if you haven't finished your paper, you're walking down the hall, would you rather meet me, your professor, or a devil from hell? 80% say they'd rather meet the devil from hell. The other 20% said they couldn't tell the difference.
Oh.
So there is a sense in which when we have not done what we should have done, we realize the good, recognizing the good, we fall down and we tremble. This is where the fear and trembling really comes in recognizing the good. Whenever Jesus sees demons, it's just a word. It's not jumping up and down, beating something up, but it's just, be gone, go into the pigs, just get away from here. There is kind of a conversation, and there's not this kind of exorcist mentality that we've seen in the movies.
Right.
And so the evil does not scare us as much as the good when we are seeking God.
Yeah, and that gets into I think of Rudolf Otto's
idea of the
holy, where you're encountering something, and I've shared this in my classes and with my congregation. The word holy really carries the idea of being other. It includes being morally good, but it really carries this idea that is something completely outside of our categories, which in monster studies, a monster, going through the etymology of monster, doesn't mean evil. It means like a sign, a show. It's something that breaks categories, and it creates this unease, where I'm now encountering something, even if it's good, it's something that is beyond, my normal capacities. So it's a really interesting tension. And I think that's where maybe Christians oftentimes either go the route of consuming all the media or not consuming anything, or trying not to consume anything, because it's hard to live with that tension of like, hey, there's context. Sometimes it's appropriate to laugh at this and sometimes it's not. And sometimes the good is overwhelming and scary, more than the evil. And it's just, I'd rather just to have this very simple binary and not deal with the messiness of life with this kind of stuff.
Lewis also, I think, gives us some wisdom and insight when he talks about whether or not we should allow children to read fairy tales and fantasy because there are monsters. And he says, basically, when he was growing up, what scared him more than anything else were insects. And he did not get his fear of insects from fairy tales. He did remember having this kind of fold-out book where this kind of giant beetle or spider would come with pincers and everything else. And that stayed in his imagination. But there's a certain kind of haunting, disabling phobia, which we don't want, pathological fears we don't want to give our children.
Right.
But those come from the way we may treat them, the way that we may beat them with a clothes hanger like they did in Mommy Dearest. Those are kind of the fears that come from kind of parental behavior of other people that really scare us. He says, on the other hand, we try to keep out of the mind the knowledge. We can't keep out of a child's mind that he or she has been born into a world of death, of violence, of wounds, of adventure, of heroism and cowardice, of good and evil. This world is full of things that are going to challenge them. And so in a world that they're growing up with, in which you have secret police, you have assassinations now, you have the atomic bomb, nuclear bombs, you have wars going on all the time, children are going to realize that there are dangers and there are monsters out there. It says what we need to do is give them brave knights and heroic courage as well. Recognizing we make their destiny brighter, not darker. These things are out there. Violence and bloodshed are going to be out there. There's something dreadful out there. But we've got to give children something that will not handicap them and just allow them to see that they can be victorious. His great quote was, "Let there be wicked kings and beheadings, battles and dungeons, giants and dragons, and let villains be soundly killed at the end of the book." Okay, you've got to show that good wins. And one of my favorite moments in Lion Witch of the Wardrobe is basically at the death of Aslan, when the White Witch gathers all these kind of frightening creatures around to kind of mock Aslan and torture him. I mean, Lewis put in there ghouls and specters, the kind of terrifying phantoms, bogles and ogres, these kind of frightful goblins and hideous flesh-eating giants, the Minotaur, which is the kind of bull-headed person, hags, cruels were the people of the toadstool, an incubus. He puts an incubus in there. An incubus is a demonic spirit that visits women sexually in their sleep. Okay. Yeah. The Ifrit, which is the evil demon from the Muslims. The wraiths, the ghosts of someone about to die, the wooses, the Edens, and the Orkneys, which are the orcs from Tolkien. Yeah. And he puts all these in there and he says, but I'm not going to describe these because if I did, grown-ups would not let you read this book. But he's already introduced to us all these kind of horrible creatures in a playful sort of way and said, let's look and let's see how we can overcome even the worst of all monsters in our imagination.
Yeah. No, that's good. And it echoes a quote that gets sometimes attributed to Neil Gaiman, sometimes G.K. Chesterton. And I'm paraphrasing a little bit. But, fairy tales essentially aren't important to teach kids that there's dragons, but that dragons can be, defeated. Yeah. It can be over.
That goes to Chesterton,
Yeah.
Neil Gaiman dedicated his books to GKC. He said, a man who knows what's going on. And unfortunately, most of our readers or listeners do not know Chesterton as well as they know Lewis. Mm-hmm. And Lewis stole so much from Chesterton. Yeah. It's just wonderful to and Lewis acknowledged it. He said, here's my source. But Chesterton, his little essay on fairy stories on the ethics of Elfland in orthodoxy is one of the best things to read.
So we can see like these themes in Disney, right? Maybe not, quite the same way, but we're moving back to Disney franchises. I mean, I think sort of the expectation, whether you're watching Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, Frozen, I could rattle off all kinds of things, even into some of Disney's newer acquisitions, like the Marvel universe. There's this expectation, like we're going to see these horrific evils, but they're going to get defeated. All that's why, we shell out big money. Nobody, I'm sure there's one that I'm not thinking of, and maybe you can think of one, but, very rarely, if at all, does Disney have a big, blockbuster release and everyone dies at the end and there's no happiness. I think people would, revolt. Like, this is the worst. This is the worst movie I've ever seen, And so I think that is part of Disney's legacy is, good triumphs. There is happily ever after. And that's important. So one, thing that comes up a lot in media studies, especially with religion and monster studies, is people's ability. I'm going to use kind of a big word, but I'm going to try to unpack it a little bit. Ability to switch between what we call meta-communicative frames. In other words, I think there is this fear that, people are going to watch a Disney film, good triumphs, it's easy, and it all happens within a 90-minute period. And people are going to think this is how reality works. This is real, whether or not the monsters are real, this solving the problem in 90 minutes is real or 2 hours. Do you see a tension within the Christian community wrestling with how the imagination informs reason and the media's impact on the mind? And what I mean by that is the fear is, if I let my kids watch this, if we let people watch this, they're going to confuse fantasy and reality and are going to get into all kinds of trouble. Or do you think we can have a little bit of confidence in people's ability to differentiate between I'm watching the Disney adaptation of a grim fairy tale, and now I'm going to work in the real world? Are people able to do that, or are people just incapable of discerning those two?
Yes and no. Okay. I think we're all still agents. We all still can kind of control how we interpret something. And if we're in a good community, the key here is community, because no individual is going to be able to protect himself or herself from what you're watching. I mean, look at the media studies on the elderly and watching television news. Mm-hmm. They cannot distinguish between fantasy and reality on news. And they become much more anxious and worried and fearful. And it's because of the way that news is packaged almost with an algorithm that if you're interested in these kind of things and they attract you and you want to see the danger in the world, the threat to you and how you're going to be scammed out of your savings, you're going to be seeing more and more of that, and you're going to believe that more and more. And so there is the danger that we can manipulate ourselves by what we choose to watch. And we need others to kind of rebuke us and kind of correct us and say, no, you're moving in this direction a little too much. You're starting to believe too much of what you're watching. And every image can become graven. Every image can become an idol. There's no doubt about that too. It has its power to kind of open things up. Lewis hated the cinema. Basically, he said there's death in the camera. Basically, when you see something, when you see Lucy in Andrew Adamson's Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, you're stuck with Georgia Henley. That's a wonderful image, but that's Lucy. If you've seen that too many times, when you're reading it, her looks can change every time. The imagination can work in so many good ways when you're reading it. Even better when you're just hearing the story. And so I think Disney, in a sense, puts out a version which is much more like a Hans Christian Andersen, except it's happy. Hans Christian Andersen is too frothy and sentimental, and everybody dies. I mean, the Little Mermaid dies, the Happy Prince dies. I mean, all these people die.
Sorry to the reader or the listeners on the podcast. They all die. Everyone dies in your
Everybody dies in Hans Christian Andersen. And there's so much violence in the Grimm brothers that we don't get. Just of the stepsisters or anybody else that Disney kind of erases and boulderizes. And so we've got to be able to recognize, I think, go to the source, read the source and be shocked, and then go see Disney, kind of a palliative. You can kind of play with it, but then talk to people and then tell the story. One of the things I have my students do is we start off by everybody telling their version of Little Red Riding Hood. And you begin to realize that there are so many kind of oral traditions that influence the way you've heard the story and the way you want to see the story. And what are they? Does she get eaten by a wolf? Is it a kind of a sexual encounter? Is it just disobedience to the mother? I'm not staying on the path. Does a hunter come? Does this God figure come? And the Grimm brothers, there's a book from Harvard professor Murphy who looked at the Bibles and the scripts of the letters of the Grimm brothers and found all this kind of theological stuff behind all these fairy tales, how they kind of began to shape religious education into the fairy tales, where Little Red Riding Hood is taking bread and wine to her grandmother. She's taking the Eucharist to the grandmother, but she disobeys. And there's judgment, but then there's rescue by the hunter, who is kind of a king. And so all these kind of theological bits are there, but you've got to go back to sources than just kind of taking the media.
Well, this gets into some critiques of Disney, too, that I bring up a little bit this season. And that sort of cultural imperialism and Disney being such a mammoth player in pop culture, where because of the production value, because of just, again, their sheer size, they really become, this is the image, this is the narrative. And if I'm following your C.S. Lewis's critique, basically the danger with Disney as a producer of culture is they are sort of freeze framing, these narratives, which in their original form, and I don't want to get into, this gets into media ecology a little bit, which is beyond our topic, but they're so powerful. They are shaping people's imagination in a way that does not maybe allow them the freedom to, as Tolkien would say, be a co-creator, to create their own image and worlds. It's sort of like, nope, this is canon. This is what it is. Disney has told us a story of Cinderella, and that's what it is, versus going back and reading it, or even seeing another version come out, where you're like, man, that was okay, but it's not the Disney version I grew up with that sort of cemented that. But how do we push back a little bit on the Disneys in the world? Not in the sense that we can't enjoy Disney, but in the sense that, like, okay, Disney, because of its size, because of its wealth, is really becoming the cultural storyteller. How do I push back or bypass that a little bit to allow other voices and other ways to imagine stories to take place?
I think one way to do that is to expand one's scope into kind of global media. Miyazaki, kind of the great Japanese Shintoist type filmmaker, is just a wonderful kind of correction to many of the Disney films. You look at the Eastern European countries and their kind of short animated films. For example, you compare a Czechoslovakian animator's name was Barta, created the story of the Pied Piper versus Disney's story of the Pied Piper. In fact, Disney's version is probably pretty frightening itself, because the children are taken away and a little lame boy. And so it's much more accurate than some of the others. It's not a happy ending compared to many of his other later films. But the Czech version is just really dark. And it just really kind of awakes you up. It's like reading Kafka. All of a sudden you wake up and you're a cockroach. What's happened? My metamorphosis here. So I think looking at media from other countries and other artists, Pixar was a wonderful kind of alternative for its early years. Being taken over by Disney, you see some of the kind of compromise that happens. And you wonder if they'll be able to get that kind of pioneer maverick spirit back again, where they just tell stories that they just really enjoy telling.
Mm.
In fact, a colleague and I are writing a book on Pixar films and Kierkegaard now.
Mm.
What's Kierkegaard? What's he doing at the movies,
Yeah.
But we're taking a lot of his kind of concepts and his stages of life and looking at how they're reflected in the films of Pete Docter and Andrew Stanton and Brad Bird and others that are there, John Lasseter. And if you study these films, and you see them together and you talk with other people, you draw out different principles. The key thing, though, I think underlying any of this for a Christian is stay in the scriptures. You've got to be reading the scriptures and reading old books every time you see something new. You've got to balance it. And when you keep reading the Gospels, it gets in your mind. It begins to kind of leaven your mind and it really kind of shapes how you are going to look. It gives you those spectacles you see through the Gospel. You see this wonderful kind of viewpoint. Otherwise, if you don't, you're going to be twisted. And all of us have been. No matter whether it's kind of violence, eroticism, vengeance. I think these revenge movies that we see are wonderful because they show us that we want justice, but we will all go beyond justice to justify the violence that someone like a Liam Neeson will do.
Yeah. Or John Wick. I think John Wick was like and it's awful, killed the puppy and then he went and like killed, thousands of people, and you're like, I don't know. I think
all these other children of mothers somewhere.
Yeah. I think we overshot the runway. Yeah. So one question, this is another one kind of gets into this tension. There are memes and ministries that float around likening Disney to the devil, a corrupting influence. It's this nefarious organization that's trying to corrupt our children. Elements that can drift into what we call a moral panic. And so how much danger is there, say, in watching a Disney program with Gothic elements versus the dark imaginings of people who have not been taught media literacy and who tend towards creating contagious conspiracy narratives?
Yeah, there are dangers in both sides. And I think the dangers of teaching children not to discern the media, but to judge those who are making the media becomes something problematic, because we remember that Jesus did die on a cross for everyone. That's even the people we don't like, even people who don't understand the truth as we understand it. His love for them is greater than our love. We have a tendency to already divide the goats and the sheep. We know where they should go instead of saying, no, what are they saying? And to recognize that it's not a battle of good and evil, but it's the fact that there is only good that has been created by God, and evil is a distortion. And so even the lies that come out from any media producer is based in some truth. And the key is to get back to what is that truth that they have recognized in this story? What do they see about human nature that maybe I have missed, that I can kind of begin to start a conversation with and saying, yeah, this is a problem. This is something that we need to deal with. There is kind of brutality towards children. There is kind of death. There is this culture of death. And so you find some common ground to start kind of giving the gospel. I think that's what Jesus did so well. In communication, there's always this kind of contrast too between Jesus and Paul. Paul speaks in theological language. Paul is talking to the church. Paul will put you to sleep and you'll fall from that second story window and die. Okay. Jesus is telling stories. He's always telling stories. Over a third of his discourse are parables about sheep and goats and coins and virgins and all of these kinds of things that are very interesting. And we have to recognize that when you're talking to people who don't believe and you want to awaken them, you tell stories. You tell your own stories and you share the stories that really have connected you in the media. And it becomes a way just to awaken them and to make us kind of responsible for communicating our understanding into the vernacular that they can understand.
What you said, that's so good. And there's a lot there that we don't have time to unpack. One thing I appreciate you saying is how, in every media that comes out, there's always this truth and error. And typically how I've heard Christians frame this is like, oh, the devil puts a little truth in all his lies. And that kind of gets into this, what you kind of alluded to, demonizing people who produce media. And you can almost reverse it and saying, there is truth even amidst the lies. And how do we discern that? And taking a little bit of the, one thing I think we like to hold up is the people we like, usually ourselves. We are 100% objectively true all the time. Every media we produce is rock solid. It's those other people that have truth mixed with error. And I think any of us, if we're humble enough, can recognize that I don't know everything. I don't communicate everything in the best way all the time. And so you can pick up any Christian or non-Christian or any human being, communicator and say, well, it's good, but it's not 100% accurate. And I can choose to demonize that person, or I can say, I disagree with this, but I think they highlight something really important that I can reflect on. And that gets into something that and I've mentioned this on the podcast before, that fundamental attribution error, where I'm going to assign these evil internal motives for why this person produced this media versus saying, out of their experience and worldview, they've produced this narrative, this movie, this book, and I don't resonate with things on page 37, but I do, connect with what they said in chapter 17, and learning to sift, and be gracious, I think, with our critique is important. C.S. Lewis's writings contain, as you've mentioned, you gave a phenomenal list of monsters and ghosts and horrible creatures. And we know that he wrestled with a draw towards spiritualism, which some Christians will point out as a reason to avoid Lewis's writings. And I see this, we're in Lewis a little bit, not Disney, but I think the principle that we're getting at is going to apply across the board. But they see his blending of various mythological monsters and his spiritualist struggles in his fantasies as a sort of gateway drug into the occult. How do you see his fiction, particularly things like The Great Divorce, as a way that the author and maybe readers are processing death and the conflicts of life that we all struggle with?
Yeah, I think it's important to put this into context in Lewis's life, that after his mother died and he went away to boarding school, and he saw a mistress that heated up his blood, as he said, basically, finally got excited as a young man. He became an atheist. And as an atheist, he was for a while kind of a Freudian. And so what brought him back to the faith was the occult a little bit, this numinous, this sense of something that is other, that maybe there is a spiritual world. And his imagination began to move in that direction, even while his reason stayed materialistic. It said, no, there can't be anything else. And so little by little, you see that God used this imagination as kind of a road out of his objectivity, out of his modernity, out of his kind of set. This is the truth is only what we see and hear and can experience with our senses. And so it really kind of teased him and woke him up. He would visit Yeats as well in his kind of little kind of smoky rooms with curtains and dark and candles and everything else, and just realize, okay, Yeats, with all of his Irish fairy tales, that Lewis loved the Irish fairy tales and the puka and everything else, I just recognized this guy is just, a fake. I mean, he's kind of silly there. But there was something there that just kind of disturbed him with this kind of occult. But he would leave that. He would leave and recognize, okay, this is there because it's a sign of a real spiritual world that does exist. And instead of going to the dark spiritual world, it really led him up more towards this idea of holiness. And he saw that holiness is supernatural. And so he moved to the supernatural world, but the occult was one step that he had to take away from materialism to move towards something that was good and holy and of God. And so by the time he gets together with Tolkien and Hugh Dyson and walks on that September evening down Addison Way, and suddenly the leaves are blowing and everything is just kind of like the Holy Spirit whispering to him, he becomes to realize that there is a God. And this is kind of a major turning point in his life. And then within weeks, he's riding a motorcycle in a kind of car seat with his brother off to the Whipsnade Zoo. And he says, yeah, Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And it just comes. Yeah. But there are steps along the way. And so you don't know where anybody is on their journey. But if once you know the truth and then you start going back down into the occult, then you are leaving what you know as true, and you are moving away from the Christ. And this is important for Lewis too, because he says a road into Jerusalem is also a road out of Jerusalem. He will say that romantic love, like Dante's love for Beatrice, is a road towards Jerusalem, towards paradise. But romantic love can also be a road away from, into eroticism, into something else. And so these roads go both ways, whether they're reason, whether they're myth. And he saw myths as shadows of the great story of a God becoming man, where it actually happened historically. And so, yeah, he was on this road, but you want to see which direction his road is going. Is it going towards Jerusalem or away? And that was key for all of us to say, are my interests in the media taking me away from the gospel messages, or are they taking me closer and helping me see from a different vantage point?
Yeah. And it's a lot of self-reflection. And those are amazing points. And I think it's again, easy for us to either get into the consume everything unquestioningly or try to consume nothing. And really, we don't want to think about why we're consuming what we're consuming. And I like what you kind of alluded to this too. And Tolkien mentions this in his essay on fairy stories. And this is how I think it could relate to Disney, where looking at the myths and the folklore of any given culture, and Paul even alludes to this, like, the people who kind of follow the law, they may not have heard the preaching of the gospel, but they're kind of doing the best they can. Disney being one of the big producers of our mythologies and our narratives. And as you pointed out, there are pious tropes in there, and there's existential questions in there. We can kind of take the position of, well, if you watch Disney, you're evil, or you can say, there's something that resonates with these stories, and how is this speaking to somebody? Maybe it's just on the level of entertainment, but maybe they're finding some hope and resonance, in this media, and maybe there's a spiritual discussion that's happening, whether they're Christian or some other, faith or no faith, recognizing that maybe these are, to use a biblical metaphor, maybe this is like the well, right? Where people are gathering and they're talking about these issues and narratives, and I can participate in that conversation and learn from them, and maybe they can learn something from me, or I can just sort of, hold my, finger and run away, which I don't know that's helpful at all. So I like what you said as far as everyone's on this journey, and the media we consume, whether it's Disney, whether it's a novel, whether it's, whatever we're consuming, oftentimes I think are leading people towards a fuller understanding of truth and reality. And I can participate in that journey. I can take an interest in people's journey, or I can, look from my ivory tower down on people and think, it's a shame that they're all deceived and know nothing. They don't know what I know, which is a, terribly, arrogant and inaccurate, in my opinion, position to view things.
This is why there's so many wonderful things about my Roman Catholic brothers and sisters in Christ, as opposed to my I'm kind of Anglican and Protestant. Mm-hmm. We Protestants are people of the word; they're people of the image often, and the ritual. But the way to see it is that the tradition of Protestants is John Bunyan. John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. It's an individual kind of going and slogging through the Slough Pond, going to Vanity Fair, just trying to make it to the celestial city. You get friends along the way, evangelists and others, but basically you're taking the journey alone. Roman Catholics give us Chaucer. Chaucer puts a whole group of really motley characters together. The wife of Bath, the knight, the parson, all of these people have their own story. Now they're all going to Canterbury to worship God at the tomb of Thomas of Becket. And they're going to go confess their sins. But along the way, they tell their stories. And so when you hear each other's stories and you're traveling together, it really opens up your vista of what God is really doing and how he's working in different stories. But you've got to be together in community. Community is so lacking today among many people. Taylor Swift concerts, you get this kind of conglomeration of people just stuck together, kind of shouting out, F the patriarchy, whatever. And instead of saying, how do we come together and tell each other our stories rather than just listen to somebody yell or sing at us?
This reminds me of something you said earlier when we were talking about what I would call like cultivation theory. You mentioned the older adult, maybe they can't get out very much. Maybe they're in an assisted living home and they watch a lot of news. They're kind of stuck in front of there, and that kind of creates this fearful mindset of the world, and they can't get out and interact with people like they used to. And I think all of us can fall into this trap, whether we're in an assisted living home or whether we're just like glued to our media, and having a picture of the world painted in a certain way that may be going out, and whether it's a church community, maybe it's just meeting a group of friends for coffee, say, hey, I've just binged 13 hours of Fox News or CNN and they can say, well, here's my perspective, here's what I'm seeing in life. Or I find this true of some of my colleagues who have pulpit ministries. They'll get up and choose to talk about a certain group of people, and it becomes very clear that they've never actually talked to this group of people or spoken with them. They've read news and some articles about them. And I thought, have you really spent the time to be on the ground and in community and in conversation with them? Because I think you would talk differently. You've kind of been sold this narrative. So I love the idea, and this kind of dovetails into my last question about making sure we have community. So for people, parents, pastors, educators, whoever is listening to this podcast episode, what are maybe 2 or 3 quick principles for people looking to make wise decisions about the media they consume? Where they love Disney, but they're trying to sift through, what are some good principles to keep in mind as I'm consuming media? What would you tell them?
I think of G.K. Chesterton's essay or a little book called The Colored Lands. And The Colored Lands talks about this boy who is basically bored. I mean, he sits outside kind of in a garden in the forest, and just everything bores him. And this magician comes along and he says, here, try on these pair of glasses. And he puts on the glasses, red glasses, and everything turns red. I mean, strawberries and just beautifully red things. And then he gives him blue glasses. He puts on the blue glasses, and the blueberries are there, and the sky is kind of bright blue, and everything is just gorgeously blue. Then he puts on green, and the trees, the leaves of the trees are just wonderful, and the broccoli and the Brussels sprouts and everything green is coming out, and goes through these different colors. And then he takes the glasses off, and the boy looks around, and he sees the green and the blue and the yellow and the red all at one time. And he sees reality and how just gorgeous it is. And I think what happens often is we can go to these media and we can see through a lens that gives us kind of one color. Disney will give us a yellow, and we'll just see that yellow over and over again. But once we take them off and we get out into reality, reality has a way of correcting us and saying, no, that's not the way it is. And I think most people can recognize that. So I would say, don't be afraid, but then also notice where you are tempted. If you are tempted towards anger towards other people, you don't want to go to these revenge movies. I mean, just see your enemy destroyed. That's a temptation. If you're disturbed by eroticism, there's certain films you stay away from. If you're concerned about being too sentimental, of things just being kind of, they make me cry, make me feel, and other things don't, stay away from them. You've got to discern what your temptations are. And that only comes too with good friends and community, where if you're married, you've got someone that does it. Hopefully that person will tell you exactly what your problems are. But when you have that sense of community, you can correct each other. You can reprove each other, which is always kind of a very healthy thing that we don't probably do enough of. We do it with our children, but once they grow up, we don't do it as much anymore. Secondly, I would say, read old books, watch old movies. I mean, go back and watch silent films. Watch films like Sparrows with Mary Pickford, Hell's Hinges with William S. Hart, Douglas Fairbanks in the Gaucho. What you find by looking at kind of old media text, you get a view of the world that is a little different than ours. And you have to have the patience to watch them. I mean, even films from the 60s and 70s are kind of going to explode your mind at times and just really disturb you. But you say, okay, what are they really saying? Then kind of lastly, have someone that is your priest. Have someone that is your counselor. Have someone that is your guidance and your tutor. We need to be able to kind of confess our sins. We need to be able to kind of talk to someone else and to find that person you can trust and in your community. Lewis had his own kind of confessor. Tolkien did. You find those kinds of people, and those people basically will save your lives at times. And if we think we don't need it, then American individualism has kind of infected us too much. And we think we can solve our own problems like a Disney film. We can't. It gets back to kind of community. But don't be afraid. Be afraid of the goodness. Be afraid of the fact that we're not doing as much as we should. That we are called to go out there and to love our neighbor, to help the poor, to do things that we forget that we're supposed to do or we just neglect to do. So those are basically a couple principles just to throw out.
That's good. Thank you, Terry. And then if people want to connect with you or learn more about your work, what's the best way they can do that?
You send money and a check. I'm kidding. I'm
Okay.
kidding. No, don't worry. I'm close to retirement. No. Basically, my email is tlindvall@vwu.edu. I teach at Virginia Wesleyan University here in Virginia Beach. And it's still the best way to get a hold of me, and I respond pretty quickly.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Terry, for being on the show.
Thank you, Seth.
Good storytelling from a Christian worldview that includes John Bunyan, G.K. Chesterton, C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and to some extent Disney, involves darkness, shadows, and villains. But ultimately, those villains are overcome by good. This means just because we see a scary villain on the surface of a story isn't reason enough to label it spiritually threatening. We need to engage with it to see how evil is treated and defeated. In John 1:5, the author describes the ministry of Jesus by saying, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." Later on, in John 14:26, Jesus says, "I have come into the world as a light, so that no one who believes in me should stay in darkness." There are countless promises like this in the Bible, extolling the power of good, but they also imply that there is darkness to be overcome. As some of our guests this season have noted, one of the sources of light in the Bible is the cross, which also happens to be one of the most brutal and evil moments in the Bible. For Christians who love peaceful pastel aesthetics, it's easy to forget that there are visceral moments that confront us in the pages of Scripture that we cannot ignore. If we do, we open ourselves to a sentimentalized view of life that lacks the tools to process and fight evil. What's more, we paint an inaccurate picture of the Bible, which brings up a challenge for people of faith. What happens when the dark stories are the ones that we find in the Bible? What happens when the people begin to deconstruct Scripture because of how monstrous the characters appear? What happens when those deconstructions result in publications that, from a conservative Christian perspective, seem to attack the Bible and the faith of those who follow it? I hope you join us next time as my special guest and I reflect on an important and challenging new book that looks at these themes and makes these points. The book is called God's Monsters: Vengeful Spirits, Deadly Angels, Hybrid Creatures, and Divine Hitmen of the Bible. Hope you join us next time. Thanks for listening to Beast and Bible.
Beast and Bible is written, researched, produced, and hosted by Dr. Seth Pierce. Ethan Geck is our editor. Logo design and social media by Chelsea Ernina. Equipment and tech help from the dynamic duo James Gigante and Stephen Husett. Producing and project help from me, Heather Moore. Thanks for listening to Beast and Bible. Tell your friends about us, and don't forget to leave a nightlight on after dark.